starting with a bit of history, it's clear that we're talking about two kinds of community and intentional community, which are both related but also slightly separate. One is the group of people, the friendship group that decides, as Lucy said at the beginning, to live together and have a shared vision. And the other is a much more wider societal community that decides to, operate on the spatial level to change the way that communities live. And they've both got very long histories. They keep all these currents submerge and keep cropping up and re-emerging. I mean, just speaking about myself, I'm here today because I share the stewardship of a wood with Kirsten, who's one of the organisers. I've just met Julian, who I haven't seen for 30 years, who used to live in a commune I visited. I was born in Lewisham Hospital and grew up in Forest Hill. It's amazing. Amazing. It reinforces that occasional paranoia that there's only 2,000 of us in the world and everybody else is a cardboard cutout. But anyway...
or a dream, as my dad used to
yes.
say. Yeah.
But to land trust. So there's long histories, in the case of intentional communities going right back to the monasteries, to the vegetarian communities that Lenin visited in the 1890s, to the, and on a societal, on a larger canvas, was the Peasants' Revolt and the Levellers and the, So we've got a very, very long heritage, really, all of us. The main practical difference, apart from the relative size, is that the friendship group type communities tend to accept their ideas are out of the mainstream, and therefore they need to retire to spaces away from the masses or create little, lacunas where they can do it. And social communitarians, on the other hand, believe that their ideas are relevant to society at large, and therefore they should set out to transform the established order. I mean, obviously that's not an exclusive definition, and they all bleed into each other. Okay. In their current form, CLTs were really developed during the Civil Rights Movement in America, and based on earlier United Kingdom models like the Garden Cities movement and the Indian models from India. The first actually was created by Martin Luther King's cousin, Slater King, and was originally to fund the land for black farmers in rural Georgia, to fund access to land. But it's increasingly adopted by urban communities, particularly predominantly white communities on the eastern seaboard in Syracuse, and there's a huge land trust in Burlington, Vermont, and gradually that American model started to be imported to England and into Europe, of course, similarly. And I first came across it because I used to work for the Lancashire Cooperative Development Agency in the 1990s, and we worked on something called CARTs, Community Asset Reinvestment Trusts, which were trying to hold property and land assets on behalf of local communities and finance things. And it wasn't a great success, but they re-emerged more recently in the form that we now recognise them, because they've been widely used by rural communities where ordinary young people that are the sons of farmers or working class people can't afford to live in tourist economy villages where land prices are dominated by the tourist pound. And so the land trusts have established themselves very strongly in Dorset and Devon. Cornwall County Council was a very early adopter, supported them. So actually, ironically, half the built community land trust units in the UK are in Cornwall at the moment. But the race is now on to develop a model that's suitable for urban situations and urban communities. And indeed, the National CL Network has a project called the Urban CLT project, of which my CLT Bristol Community Land Trust is a member. Okay, so that, just to one more point on that has of course been given a big boost by the localism agenda of the new, well, not new anymore, the second Tory government, but it emerged, all that encouragement to go out and build in our communities and meet with our neighbours and decide what, and build, all came in through Grant Shapps' rather egregious kind of presentation of the Localism Act in 1910. Okay, CLTs now form a broad, are now part of a broad community-led land and asset movement which incorporates, as we've already heard, housing co-ops, development trusts, transition towns, self-build, co-housing. You know, we're centred in all that, and all these things bleed into each other. These all aim to remove land and property assets from a market-based asset value system, investment system, to a use value system based on the costs to users remaining sort of related and commensurate with a reasonable proportion of the added value derived from their use and occupation. So what we're trying to do is, you know, get off this superheated world kind of irrationality that produced the we're all taking out our asset values every year, revaluing them by 10%, turning them into white goods and driving the economy, you know, and it's all obviously completely unreal, it's all completely inflationary, it's all unsustainable. So land trusts are trying to take land out of the market, hold it in stewardship in perpetuity for local people, and let them have it for its use value. That's the kind of philosophical underpinning of the way land trusts are emerging in England now. CLTs have a very radical agenda focusing on removing land from the national and property market and putting it in the service of local communities. They are therefore, by their nature, an implicit critique of a housing and land apportionment system based on concentrations of wealth and landholding, and a valuation system that benefits from the undersupply of the basic human requirement for affordable housing. CLTs set out to improve opportunities for families and small friendship communities, but they also aim to incorporate the strategic planning and the longer view that, you know, a wider societal definition of community incorporates. So in a sense they are the coalescing of the two different kind of related conceptions of community. The smaller intentional communities that we've largely been talking about, with funds and resourceful members, Maria's talked about, can always decamp to areas of lower competition. We're hearing it's not that simple. But I mean, that's been the model that's been used, and set up new intentional communities. But most of these initiatives, as we've also been hearing, interesting though their visions may be, have limited capacity to support poorer or less resourceful members of wider society, or to develop much regenerative momentum in existing communities of place which are failing socially or economically. And I think we've heard a lot of instances of that in the previous speakers, how, you know, it's hard to cope with ethnicity problems, with class problems. And so operating at a larger strategic level allows planning for individual projects to fit within the larger scheme, and hopefully to backfill some of the difficulties and the shortcomings that those projects, by their very nature, have to cope with. This is particularly relevant when we consider how to respond to the UK housing crisis. Even though owner-occupation of residential property peaked in 2002 at almost 70% of the population, it's actually down 5% now after 2 Tory governments. Our political and economic model is still based on notions of the property-owning democracy. So we've all grown up to see this as normal and desirable, and many of us have, I mean, I hold my hand up, have benefited financially from rapidly rising values of our major light investment in our homes. Since the recent crash, however, when this model was tested almost to destruction by the failures of the big institutional lenders, we started to look more critically at the long-term implications of such a system. And as one or two people, I think Maria talked about the Dutch and Scandinavian experience, when you look across the channel, this idea that somehow this property-owning democracy is natural or desirable, it completely falls apart, because they don't do it like that in Europe. Even extremely well-heeled people in Germany live in rented houses, are content to do so, there's no stigma in it. The German housing market is very stable. The costs of housing have risen about 2% a year steadily for 30 years. They're about half what they are, and, you know, so actually there are much better ways to do it, and the evidence is not very far away if you want to look for it. Land trusts therefore seek to hold property assets in stewardship in perpetuity. Once asset value financing is rejected, however, assembling finance, as we've already heard from others, particularly Featherstone, assembling finance to create community-based developments is challenging. Development costs are essentially built up from land costs, building costs, finance costs, professional fees, and developer profit. So CLTs can largely forgo a profit motive once their operating costs are found, but being small, they're largely locked into the same market prices and market mechanisms as commercial or public sector developers. So put simply, therefore, it's not possible to borrow a lot of money, go out and buy a site, commission a design, commission a contractor, build houses, put people in paying social and affordable rents and pay back what you borrowed, because the sums don't work. And, I mean, you know, once again, heard this already. So what Land Trust don't do, and what we particularly in Bristol Land Trust do, is we try and fill some of that missing gap in the finance. It's about a third actually, or a quarter, or it depends on the project. We try and do it by getting some public funding, by cross-subsidy, by an element of self-build or self-finish, by a resident capital contribution, as some other people have, you know, talked about in co-housing schemes, and also by another aspect of co-housing, which is somewhat untested so far, but we believe in it, which is you don't need to own so much private space if there are very good communal facilities. So in principle, you can take a smaller footprint in your privately owned space and therefore incur less costs. However, CLTs are caught in an awkward political no man's land here, appealing to Tory localism, but not to risky uses of public money. And under a Labour government, appealing to public sector enthusiasm for increased levels of affordable housing, but not, as Maria has told us, to loss of control over the land or the delivery process. So, you know, we're everybody's friend and nobody's friend. So just briefly, that's the kind of the big picture. So how all this plays out in some Bristol CLT projects. We formed in 2011. The council employed some consultants to see if it was possible to improve the supply of affordable housing in Bristol by starting a co-housing scheme. They held a lot of community meetings attended by 2.5 people, one of which was me on one occasion. And then local housing activists said, look, can we get involved in this? And he said, well, what would you like to do? Well, can we hold an event? Well, you know, give us a bit of money. And we printed a poster, spent a week of our lives sticking it on every wall in Bristol, hold a launch with people queuing around the block, and the member for housing was, his eyes popping up, he said, very impressive. And it gave us £300,000 venture fund from the council and revenue funding for a half-time worker for 2 years. So that's what we've been doing. But what we found is, you know, very similar in London. Bristol's has the greatest disparity between average incomes and house prices anywhere in Britain outside of London. So there is a massive property crisis. Bristol, the year before last, Bristol, there's 20 or 30,000 people on the housing waiting list. Bristol built 11 or 12 affordable houses 2 years ago of all the council. You know, it is dire. So we're in partnership with the council. We've taken their dollar. We have to work with them. They offer us not very good sites. We settled on one site, difficult to use. The only one we really practically had a serious chance at after a long selection process. Immediately get into a clash of silos. You assume that if you ask a public authority a question, you'll get a corporate answer, but actually what you discover is that local authorities, Bristol being a prime example, are actually clusters of completely separate organisations, all with their own budgets, property portfolios, strategic plans, operating under a single brand. So we have a beautiful site on the edge of a park. We can't come in from the road, we have to come in through the park. Fantastic help from the planners, the highways, the legal department, the affordable housing team, until we talk to the parks, of course, which is another country. Parks don't want to know. So if you want an access strip across our land. You will resurface the car park, move 6 mature trees, build new public toilets in the park. You know, so that's the kind of thing you run up against, and it reinforces the experience of Maria and other people, I think. You know, it is a poison chalice, really. So we're caught in the larger politics of the council. Within September before last, 18 months ago, 20 months ago, we're all ready to go. We have a scheme. Within a week, we're told by the council, we've been telling you for a year that we will sell you the site for £1. Sorry, can't do that anymore. Same, within a fortnight, told by the Homes and Communities Agency, we've been telling you for a year that in order to get this £250,000 grant, you won't need to become a registered provider. Sorry, got that wrong. You will have to be a registered provider. And then our funder, Charity Bank, said, oh, this is getting very, very complicated. So the whole thing ran off the rails, and it took us another year to get it back. We are now on site with 12 affordable houses and a lot of sweat and that, you know. That's why I laughed when Lucy said, you know, they thought they were going to go to 4 meetings, and they obviously missed a couple of noughts off, you know, the end of all that. But of course, it's been a very painful process, and what most of our, you know, our supposed partners and political masters miss is actually, it's all very well Grant Shapps standing up in the Commons and saying, oh, the local people in their communities will get, you know, but you can't actually deliver what people don't want to do. My colleagues and I have a board with a fantastic team, and the reason I do it is because I work with amazing people. Includes a director of a medium-sized housing corporation, a national expert in CO2 finance, several architects, a self-builder who started the National Self-Build Association. We have come to the brink trying to do this. The idea that ordinary people in their, you know, in suburban communities in Swindon are going to get this together, forget it. They are not. So, you know, very, very difficult. And we're heading now towards a conference of our members, and hopefully a wider conference with other self-build community-led housing groups in Bristol. How do we go about it? There's very little coming out of the pipe. We have to have a step change. Doesn't look like working with the council is going to deliver it. Just finish with a few things about our current scheme. We're developing on a backland site with rough wood on it, a mixed community. We're going to sell 6 service plots for people to build their own houses, market-based. We're going to get our partner housing association to build a terrace or a layout of mainstream affordable housing. So they'll do all the registered provider, all the grant stuff. And we're going to build a co-housing scheme, probably in the form of a block of flats for Land Trust members. So we'll have a mixed tenure site. The challenge of that site is that it's got a wood on it at the moment, and it's surrounded by houses and a railway line, and people like looking out of their back windows onto the wood. So the big problem was always going to be how to get the neighbours on board. And we held a year of consultation and essentially said, we'd like to build this, we'd like to work with you as a community. If you don't want us to do it, we're not going to do it. But we didn't say this, but I think they all got the point that you might think, we won't do it, but somebody will. And you might think, better the devil you know than devil you don't. So what we've done now is we've set up a steering group that is half formed from the neighbours that live around the site, half formed from Land Trust members. They are the clients for the design, and they're working with the architects. I don't think anybody's done this before, so we might be breaking ground on the perpetual problem of NIMBYs. I mean, this relates directly to what Lucy was saying about the Forest Hill experience of working with the neighbours. We always knew that we had to get that one right if anything was going to happen. So we're on with that. And interestingly, of course, the council has just told us that despite telling them for 18 months what we're going to do, they're not happy for us to have the freehold of the site, although the whole point of Land Trust is to hold freehold forever. They want the housing association to have it and lease it to us. So it's more, more of the same. Next steps to finish. Everybody watch out on the extension of the right to buy. We could all get caught in it.
Not in Wales, we're abolishing it in Wales.
Oh, right, okay, well, very good for Wales. And it may not work, of course, there's lots of people, and the housing associations are about to take the government to do a legal challenge. Questions, therefore, over partnership working with local authorities, I've already mentioned. we're searching for a much more simpler, much more down-to-earth, much more down-home, barn-raising approach to getting the enthusiasm and dynamism and energy of young people to build their own houses. You know, we want to get a bunch of kids and a pile of pallets on a site in Avonmouth and get them to build houses for 50 quid. Obviously, that's not practical, but that's where we want to be. We don't want to be stuck in this endless bureaucratic porridge. You know, we've got 12 houses coming out of the site after 4.5 years' work by, as I said, a crack team of people. A very conservative estimate of the value of our time, 4 years, £100,000 of our investment in professional time. You can't get local authorities to accept that as a kind of as a basis for an equal partner relationship. Okay, so mobilising enthusiasm, resourcefulness of young people and staying edgy. There's no point in us trying to be yet another housing association. The pot of housing, affordable housing fund money is fixed, and it doesn't deliver anything to keep slicing up into smaller and smaller pieces and handing it out. If we just base our economic model on taking government funding to fill the missing third, we don't add any value, and you know it's a zero-sum game in essence. So we're trying to find new models. As we grow in skill and experience, we're going to try and be more effective social entrepreneurs on behalf of our community and try and do things in different ways. We're going to try and venture. We're going to try and find value where nobody else can find it. And as we develop, we can and have units coming out the pipe, albeit with pain, on, and build up a portfolio. We're obviously going to be able to put pressure more effectively and become more influential. And my last thought is this: we all want to live in a society that's liberal, tolerant, diverse, and convivial, which celebrates diversity and cares for its less able and wealthy members. That's kind of given, I think. We're all here because we believe in that. When as now the short-termist policies of the government act to undermine these values, we need to build new sustainable institutions to protect, support and nurture these public goods and place them beyond the control of opportunist politicians. CLTs are these kinds of institutions.